For example, discussions of multiculturalism too quickly assume a necessary relation between identity and culture. But in what sense does a culture belong to a group? If it is historical, then we are likely to be pulled into strongly conservative positions. For example, American culture is European, and certainly in that case, the ideology of progress will reinscribe structures of racism, imperialism, and ethnocentrism. If it is ethnic, then the US, in fact, every society is and probably always has been multicultural. If it is special, then the problems of contemporary mobility appear insurmountable. I will suggest that the question of a multicultural society is a normative ethical one. To what extent can a society continue to exist without a common, albeit constantly rearticulated and negotiated culture? What are the conditions through which people can belong to a common collective without becoming representatives of a single definition? After all, one cannot deny that the US is and has been a multi-ethnic society with a wide range of cultural practices. What is that is changing? What is it that is changing? What are the questions that need to be addressed? What are possible new models of political communities and alliances? It is by now common to assert that the centrality of the concept of identity in both theoretical and political discourses is a modern development. If identity as a central problematic is modern, there are at least three aspects of logics that constitute a terrain within which that relationship is constituted. A logic of difference, a logic of individuality, and a logic of temporality. I want to contest the current direction of cultural studies by locating its theoretical foundations in each of these logics and offering three corresponding alternatives: a logic of otherness, a logic of productivity, and a logic of spatiality. If identity is somehow constituted by and constitutive of modernity, then the current discourses of identity fail to challenge their own location within and implication with the formations of modern power. Obviously, I can only hope to provide the barest outlines of my argument here. Identity and difference in cultural studies. Within cultural studies, investigations of the Constitution and politics of identity are often predicated on a distinction nicely articulated by Hall, 1990, between two forms of struggle over two models of the production of identities. It is important to recognize that Hall offers this not as a theoretical distinction, although it certainly can be mapped onto the dispute between essentialists and anti-essentialists, but as a historical and strategic distinction. The first model assumes that there is some intrinsic and essential content to any identity which is defined by either a common origin or a common structure or experience or both. Struggling against existing constructions of a particular identity takes the form of contesting negative images with positive ones, and of trying to discover the authentic and original content of the identity. Basically, the struggle over representations of identity here takes the forms of offering one fully constituted, separate and distinct identity in place of another. The second model emphasizes the impossibility of such fully constituted, separate and distinct identities. It denies the existence of authentic and originary identities based in universally shared with origin or experience. Identities are always relational and incomplete in process. Any identity depends upon its difference form, its negation of some other term, even as the identity of the later term depends upon its difference form, its difference from its negation of the former. As Hall 1991 puts it, identity is a structured representation which only achieved is possible through the narrow eye of the negative. It has to go through the eye of the needle of the other before it can construct itself. Identity is always a temporary and unstable effect of relations which define identities by marking differences. Thus, the emphasis here is on the multiplicity of identities and differences rather than on a singular identity and on the connections or articulations between the fragments or differences. The fact of multiple identities gives rise to the necessity of what Cobena Mercer has called the mantra of race, class and gender, 1992. The challenge is to be able to theorize more than one difference at once. This suggests a much more difficult politics because the sides are not given in advance, nor in neat divisions. Michelle Wallace, 1994, says, and echoing June Jordan, the thing that needed to be said. Women are not to be trusted just because they are women, any more than blacks are to be trusted because they are black, or gay because they are gay, and so on. Here, struggles over identity no longer involve questions of adequacy or distortion, but of the politics of representation itself. That is, politics involves questioning how identities are produced and taken up through practices of representation, obviously influenced by Derrida. Such a position sees identity as an entirely cultural, even an entirely linguistic construction. While this model certainly suggests that identity is one term cannot be explored or challenged without a simultaneous investigation of the second term. This is rarely the case in practice. Most work in cultural studies is concerned with investigating and challenging the construction of subaltern, marginalized, or dominated identities, although some recent work has begun to explore dominant identities as social constructions. Rarely, however, are the two ever studied together, as the theory will seem to dictate as mutually constitutive. It is obviously this second model which defines work around identity in cultural studies, but I do not mean to suggest that this model defines a singular theoretical position or vocabulary. On the contrary, there are a number of different overlapping, intersecting, and sometimes even competing figures which, taken together, define the space within which cultural studies has theorized the problem of identity. Often they function together to define specific theories. Interestingly, these figures construct a continuum of images of spatiality. Although, as I will suggest, they are for the most part structures of temporality, I will describe these figures as difference, fragmentation, hybridity, border, and diaspora. The figure of difference describes a particular constitutive relation of negativity in which the subordinate term, the marginalized other or subaltern, is a necessary and internal force of destabilization existing within the identity of the dominant term. The subaltern here is self-constitutive of and necessary for the dominant term. The instability of any dominant identity, since it must always and already incorporate its negation, is the result of the very nature of language and signification. The subaltern represents an inherent ambiguity of instability at the center of any formation of language or identity, which constantly undermines language's power to define an unified, stable identity. We can identify two variants of this figure. Notions of supplement locate the other outside of the field of subjectivity, as it were, as pure excess. Notions of negativity locate the other within the field of subjectivity as a constitutive exotic other. In the former, the subaltern constitutes the boundaries of the very possibility of subjectivity. In the latter, the subaltern may be granted an incomprehensible subjectivity. There are numerous examples of these two variants of two figures of difference in contemporary theories of identity, for example. For example, Lyotard, 1990, sees the Jews as that which European culture cannot identify because its exclusion, its unamiability, is itself constitutive of European identity. Similarly, Babas, 1994, notion of mimicry as an intentional misappropriation of the dominant discourse locates the power of the subaltern in a kind of textual insurrection in which the subaltern is defined only by its internal negation of the colonizer. The Certeaus, 1984, attempt to define subordinate populations only by their lack of place, which will entitle them to their own practices or strategies, similarly ends up defining the subaltern as pure difference. Finally, there is a common reading of Said's Orientalism, 1978, in which the dominant power necessarily constructs its order as a repressed and desired difference. The figure of fragmentation emphasizes the multiplicity of identities and of positions within any apparent identity. It thus sees a particular concrete or lived identity as a kind of dissemblement and reassembled unity. Araway, 1991. Identities are thus always contradictory, made up out of partial fragments. Theories of fragmentation can focus on the fragmentation of either individual identities or of the social categories of difference within which individuals are placed, or some combination of the two. Further, such fragmentations can be seen as either historical or constitutive. This is perhaps the most powerful image, certainly in British cultural studies, with echoes in Ebdige's notion of cut and mix, and Gilroy's notion of syncretism. Donna Haraway, 1991, also seems to offer such a figure in the image of a cyborg as a potent subjectivity synthesized from the fusion of outsider identities, or from David Bailey and Stuart Hall, 1992, identities can therefore be contradictory and are always situational. In short, we are all involved in a series of political games around fractured or discentered identities. Since black signifies a range of experiences, the act of representation becomes not just about the decentering the subject, but actually exploring the kaleidoscopic conditions of blackness. The figure of hybridity is more difficult to characterize for its often used synonymously with a number of other figures. Nevertheless, I will use it to describe three different images of border existences, of subaltern identities as existing between two competing identities. Images of a third space, as in Baba, see subaltern identities as unique third terms, literally defining an in-between place inhabited by the subaltern. Images of liminality collapse the geography of the third space into the border itself. The subaltern lives, as it were, on the border. In both of these variants of hybridity, the subaltern is neither one nor the other, but is defined by its location in a unique spatial notion which constitutes it as different from either alternative. Neither colonizer nor pre-colonial subject, the post-colonial subject exists as a unique hybrid which may, by definition, constitute the other two as well. Closely related to these two figures of hybridity is that of the border crossing, marking an image of betweenness which does not construct a place or condition of its own other than the mobility, uncertainty, and multiplicity of the fact of the constant border crossing itself. Often these three versions of hybridity are conflated in various ways, as in Gloria's and Ansaldua's 1987 descriptions of the Aztlan. A borderland is a vague and undermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. People who inhabit both realities are forced to live in the interface between the two. Finally, the figure of diaspora is closely related to that of border crossing, but it is often given a more diachronic inflection. This figure has become increasingly visible through the work of anthropologists such as James Clifford and Smadar Lavie, cultural critics such as Paul Gilroy, and various post-colonial theorists. As Jim Clifford describes it, 1994, the term diaspora is a signifier not simply of transnationality and movement, but of political struggles to define the local. I would prefer to call it place, as a distinctive community in historical context of displacement. That is, diaspora emphasizes the historically spatial fluidity and intentionality of identity, its articulation to structures of historical movements, whether forces or chosen, necessary, desired. Diaspora links identity to spatial location and identifications to histories of alternative cosmopolitanisms and diasporic networks, Clifford in press. While this figure offers significantly new possibilities for a cultural politics that avoids many of the logics of modern by rooting identity in structures of affiliations and ways of belonging, it is too often drawn back into the modern. Identity is ultimately returned to history, and the subaltern's place is subsumed within a history of movements and an experience of oppression which privileges privilege particular exemplars and the proper figures of identity.